world had fallen into a deep, dark decay. The golden age of peace was a fading memory, and the silver and bronze ages had passed in a blur of increasing greed. Now the Iron Age had arrived, and with it the hearts of men had turned to stone.
A profitable exchange.
Honor was replaced by deceit and hospitality. The most sacred law of the gods was treated with contempt. Violence ruled the streets, and the smoke rising from the earth was no longer from pious sacrifices, but from the burning of plundered cities. From high atop Olympus, Zeus watched with growing disgust. He decided to descend to earth one last time, disguised as a weary, humble traveler, to see if a single spark of goodness remained. He traveled to the rugged land of Arcadia, to the palace of King Lycaon, a man whose cruelty was whispered about even in the heavens. Zeus arrived at the palace gates as night fell, requesting shelter. Instead of the traditional welcome, Lycaon looked at the traveler with murderous suspicion. To test if his guest was truly a god, Lycaon committed a crime that made the stars turn pale. He slaughtered a young hostage, boiled his limbs, and served the human flesh to Zeus at the banquet table. It was the ultimate insult to the divine order. The king of the gods did not eat. He rose from the table, his eyes flashing with a light more terrifying than any storm. With a single flick of his wrist, a thunderbolt shattered the palace walls. Lycaon fled into the night, screaming in terror, but his voice began to crack and deepen into a howl. His clothes turned to coarse gray fur. His hands became paws tipped with claws. Zeus had transformed him into a wolf, condemning him to a form that matched his savage soul. But as Zeus looked out from the ruins of Arcadia, he realized that Lycaon was not an exception. He was the rule. The rot of wickedness had spread to every corner of the world. A single thunderbolt would not be enough to clean the earth. Zeus returned to Olympus with a heavy heart and a final, devastating resolution. The human race had failed, and the only way to save the world was to drown it. Zeus stood upon the highest peak of Olympus, his hand gripping a thunderbolt that throbbed with enough power to reduce the world to ash. He hesitated, however. He remembered an ancient prophecy that the day would come when the entire ether, the very fabric of the heavens, would catch fire. If he struck the earth with his lightning now, the flames might climb high enough to consume his own palace and the stars themselves. He would not risk the sky to punish the ground. Instead, he chose a weapon that was silent, ancient, and absolute: water. He called upon the winds. He imprisoned the north wind, which clears the clouds, and unleashed Notus, the south wind. Notus flew across the world, his wings heavy with moisture and his beard dripping with storms. Black clouds gathered until the sun was a forgotten memory, and the sky began to collapse in a relentless, punishing downpour. But rain alone was not enough to erase the stain of humanity. Zeus reached out to his brother Poseidon, the lord of the seas. Poseidon did not need words. He understood the grim necessity of the purge. He struck the earth with his trident, a blow so powerful that it cracked the continental plates and opened the veins of the world. He commanded the rivers to burst their banks and the hidden springs of the deep to erupt. The boundary between land and sea vanished. It was a blue apocalypse. Forests that had stood for centuries were swallowed by the rising tide. Cities that had been the pride of the Iron Age became silent, underwater tombs. The peasant was swept away beside the king, and the wolf drowned alongside the sheep. Dolphins swam through the branches of submerged oak trees, and where the eagle once soared, the shark now hunted. The highest mountains became lonely islands, and then, one by one, even they disappeared beneath the churning gray waves. The world was no longer a home for life. It had returned to the chaotic, watery void from which it was born. In the midst of this liquid graveyard, a single object defied the hunger of the abyss. It was not a grand ship or a war galley, but a humble wooden chest, built from sturdy timber and sealed with pitch. Inside were Deucalion and his wife Pyrrha. They were not chosen by Zeus for their power, but for their hearts. Deucalion, the son of the wise Prometheus, had inherited his father's foresight. He had seen the signs of the gathering storm and built the vessel just as his father had whispered to him from his chains. Pyrrha, the daughter of Pandora, brought with her the same hope that had once been trapped at the bottom of a jar. For 9 days and 9 nights, they drifted through a world that had lost its shape. There were no landmarks, no birds to guide them, and no sun to mark the passing of time. Only the relentless drumming of rain against the wood and the terrifying silence of a drowned civilization beneath them. They were floating over the tops of palaces and temples where thousands had once lived, now reduced to a cold, dark stillness. On the 10th morning, the rain finally ceased. The heavy, gray curtains of the sky parted, and for the first time in over a week, a pale light touched the water. The chest gave a sudden, violent jolt. It had not hit a wave but solid ground. As the waters began to recede, the vessel came to rest on the jagged peaks of Mount Parnassus, the only place on Earth high enough to still touch the heavens. Deucalion pushed open the lid and stepped out into the thin, cold air. The sight that met them was devastating. The world was a vast desert of mud and slime, littered with the debris of a lost age. There were no trees, no animals, and no voices. They were the last 2 humans in existence, a king and queen of a kingdom of ghosts. The weight of their loneliness was heavier than the floods had ever been. They had survived the wrath of Zeus, but now they faced a challenge just as terrifying: how to live in a world that had completely ended. Deucalion and Pyrrha descended the muddy slopes of Mount Parnassus, their footsteps heavy with the grief of a lost world. They traveled until they reached the ruins of an ancient temple dedicated to Themis, the goddess of divine law and prophecy. The temple was draped in seaweed and silt, its altars cold and abandoned, but it remained a sacred bridge between the mortal and the divine. The couple fell to their knees on the wet stones, weeping as they prayed for the restoration of their kind.
O goddess, if the gods are not entirely consumed by their wrath, tell us how we may bring life back to this desolate earth.
The air in the temple grew thick, and a voice like the grinding of tectonic plates echoed from the inner sanctum. The oracle did not offer comfort. She offered a riddle that chilled their blood.
Depart from my temple with veiled heads and loosened robes, and throw behind you the bones of your great mother.
Pyrrha recoiled in horror, her face pale. To her, the command was a supreme sacrilege.
I cannot obey. To disturb the bones of one's mother is an insult to the dead.
But Deucalion stood silent, his mind racing. He was the son of Prometheus, the titan of foresight, and he knew that the gods rarely spoke in literal terms. He looked at the vast, muddy plains and the jagged rocks scattered across the landscape. A realization struck him like a bolt of lightning. Our great mother is not a woman of flesh and blood. He whispered to his wife, his eyes shining with a sudden spark of hope. Our mother is Gaia, the earth herself, who gives life to all things. And if the earth is our mother, then what are her bones? He reached down and picked up a heavy, gray stone from the mud. These are her bones, the stones of the earth. Following the goddess's strange command, they walked forward without looking back, tossing the bones of the mother over their shoulders. As the stones struck the earth, a miracle began to unfold that defied the very laws of nature. The hard, cold rocks did not bounce or shatter. Instead, they began to soften. They grew supple and warm, losing their rigid edges and taking on the blurred shapes of living things. Slowly, like sculptures emerging from a block of marble, the stones thrown by Deucalion stood tall, their features sharpening into the faces of men. The stones thrown by Pyrrha followed suit, their forms curving into the shapes of women. This was the birth of a new humanity, the stone race. They were not molded from the delicate clay of the original creation, but forged from the literal foundation of the earth. Because of their origin, these new humans were harder, more resilient, and better equipped to endure the labor, sickness, and sorrow that had been released from Pandora's jar. They were a people built to survive in a world that had once tried to drown them. Zeus, watching from the heavens, saw the smoke of their first fires rising from the valleys. He saw their piety and their strength, and he allowed his thunderbolts to remain silent. The cycle of destruction had finally ended. Humanity had been reset, reborn not from the whim of a god, but from the bone-deep persistence of the earth itself. The Great Flood receded into memory, leaving behind a race that knew that even when the world ends, life has a way of rising again from the rocks.